Okay, I'm about to get started again, so if everybody could take seats. Okay, so this is our final session, and you may remember that I told you at the start of the day that essentially what we're going to have to kind of round things out are sort of our higher level, big picture conversations. So just to introduce everyone to the last session of the day. So again, that special topic, sort of higher level. And just a reminder that, so first of all, we have 3 speakers, not 4. Okay, so 3 20-minute presentations and then final Q&A and just a few closing comments. A reminder for our online audience that I will be monitoring the Q&A, so feel free as questions occur to you to drop them in that Q&A and I can pose those. But just to introduce our speakers, so Nicole Ladevaia is the Director of Research and Restoration for CHNEP, which is the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership. So their regional focus, it's an extensive area just north of Collier County, includes some notable local waters, including Donah and Roberts Bay, Lemon Bay, Charlotte Harbor, Pine Island Sound, and Estero Bay. But one of the things that's going to be great is that Nicole has agreed to share some of their really high-level lessons learned from projects that they've partnered on. So we're really going to appreciate that insight and sort of that. It'll be a good chance to sort of synthesize some of what we've heard today. Dr. Lara is a research ecologist. She's going to be our one virtual person in this this session, and she's going to talk about a bit about urban tree planting, which I know that we have some focus on that in the city of Naples and some of our local areas. But she's been involved in some research about what makes some of those planting initiatives really effective. And so we're really excited to get that sort of high-level perspective, especially because of the fact that tree canopy really does so much work for us. You know, it really addresses those high heat issues. It can keep a lot of stormwater off the ground. So they're a really important tool that sometimes gets left out of that sort of nature-based solution conversation. You know, of course, outside of some of our coastal trees like mangroves, but urban tree canopy is important too. And lastly, one of our previous panelists, Tom Ankersen, will help us to close out our event today. He gave some really important context during the panel. He's going to dive further into talk about how to embed policy preferences for these solutions into Florida law. So stick around and then we'll have a final Q&A. So I'm going to ask Nicole to come up and kick things off for us.
All right, great. Thank you for having me today and for sticking around to the last session. So as mentioned, my name is Nicole Ladevaia. I am the Director of Research and Restoration. I'll be giving this presentation on behalf of our Executive Director and the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership. I will be giving a scaled out summary of some of the overarching themes that other presenters have already touched on as a part of their sort of lessons learned from project implementation. The CHNEP has been working in this collaborative space since about 1995, and we're applying some of the concepts that we've used in our work to some of the funding and assistance we're beginning to contribute to resiliency planning and projects that are sort of gaining ground in Southwest Florida in the recent years. Oh, great. Okay. So what is the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership? We are an EPA-funded program. This is actually congressionally designated funding for estuaries of national significance. So that's our program area you can see there. We don't really follow jurisdictional boundaries, which is going to be important in some of these points that I'm going to pull out later. But we encompass over 5,000 square miles across 10 counties in central and southwest Florida. The estuaries that we focus on range from Lemon and Don and Roberts Bay in Sarasota County, Charlotte Harbor in Charlotte County, all the way down through Pine Island Sound, Matlacha, Caloosahatchee estuaries in Lee, and down to Estero Bay, just touching on Collier. So we're sort of dovetail with some of the areas that the Conservancy focuses on as well. So part of what we do is we're a partnership of all of the regional entities working in this area. So that means federal government agency folks, local government folks, state folks, NGOs, private citizens, as well as bringing together some of the technical experts that are working at private companies, and we convene them during regularly scheduled meetings. We hold 3 meetings a year for different, we have a policy committee, we have a management committee, which is natural resource managers, a technical advisory committee, which is scientists, and then a citizens committee. So our whole focus is estuary protection. We work in a collaborative space, balancing the needs of human communities with the needs of natural resources. All right, great. So our recent work has been funded with bipartisan infrastructure funding. And so that's some of that federal funding we're bringing down to leverage against local funds to produce bigger projects in this area. So again, we're working with local communities to identify and fill gaps. One of the benefits is we can work regionally, a lot like some of these NGOs that are here as well. And we have established relationships with everyone that works in this space. So we already have these spaces where everyone can come together, just like we're doing today, and share ideas and lessons learned, and talk about, it's building relationships, because that's sometimes how we move these projects forwards. So in the past several years, there have been record investments at the federal level to address climate change and enhance resiliency, same at the state level. And we are ourselves receiving an additional $1 million a year to support resiliency work in our region. So I'm going to get into how we're spending that. And then there's a lot going on at the state level too that we're trying to assist with to accelerate the ability to undertake projects, assess our vulnerabilities, and further things in our region and states. So basically, this is an overview of our overarching goals that we operate under. There we go. Sorry, walking away from the microphone. To advance basically watershed and wildlife protection within our region. So this is our strategic plan. This is agreed upon by all the partners. And these are our 4 main focus areas: water quality improvement, hydrologic restoration, fish, wildlife, and habitat protection, and public engagement. And so resiliency kind of has a place in each and every one of these too. So this is kind of a space that naturally folds into the work that we're already doing. And then, because we're bringing all of these entities together that are doing this work, we wanted to share with you all today some of the overarching things that we're going to tie together from the fantastic presentations we've heard today, and the real-world examples that have already been shared. So we applied sort of our strategic approach to resiliency. So this is our 3-pronged resiliency approach. So we're looking to enhance climate understanding and engagement, which means funding conducting more scientific research where there's need. This also means funding projects, funding pilot projects, and consensus building to engage policymakers and stakeholders, and continued public engagement to inform citizens and to have everybody sort of along for the ride at the inception, because it's so much easier to build these partnerships, not at the back end, but at the front end before you even start the process. The second is going with the flow. This involves planning and implementing projects to deliver clean, fresh water through hydrologic restoration, water quality initiatives, and water storage, which can help with groundwater recharge, redirecting floodwaters away from areas where it's doing harm to areas where it can be beneficial for water supply. And then finally, our third approach is giving wildlife and habitat pathways and spaces to migrate in response to climate-induced vegetative community shifts, helping to build healthy habitats and increased native populations, which are better able to cope with the stressors that we're seeing just on the daily, and also from sort of climate stressors as well. So I'm going to give you a couple specific examples and initiatives as to how we implement this strategy, and then I'm going to launch into our lessons learned. So first, to enhance climate understanding and engagement, we want to provide climate science and share resiliency strategies with professionals and the public. One way we do this is to host and organize an annual climate summit. I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end. We have one coming up in September. You're all invited. To bring everyone together to exchange information about how to advance regional resiliency and learn more about the science that's going on, because it is rapidly evolving. We also, as I mentioned, hold regular meetings with a lot of the partners that own these public lands, that are working in these spaces, whether it be private firms that are working working on projects, whether it be the local governments that own the lands or the permitting agencies. And then we also provide a way to centralize and share data online through our technical website, the CHNEP Water Atlas. We're providing funding assistance for municipalities to undertake comprehensive vulnerability assessments, which they're all doing across the state right now. We are working in partnership with their staff to pull in the best data or even to fund monitoring gaps because, some of these counties don't necessarily have the funds to even have, gauges to understand what's going on with water in their area. To develop and implement plans for building for the future or setting them up to be eligible for grant funding to construct beneficial projects down the road. So just to give you a quick 10,000 foot view of the CHNEP Water Atlas. We actually just relaunched this Water Atlas 2.0. This is meant to be a public-friendly website for use by policymakers, natural resource professionals, and the public to gain information on historic and current conditions of our water body areas. There's over 600 water body, basin, and watershed pages available on our website, and I think we've touched every single one modified every single one uniquely. And we also relaunched this with interactive climate change mappers. I like to say that we are not necessarily the collectors of the data, we are the conveners of the data. We're working with these great scientists and partners who are collecting amazing data, but sometimes it's sitting on somebody's hard drive, so we're trying to pull it all into one space because it's really informative for planning. And so we collect data and we group it into water quality, hydrology, wildlife and habitat, and again, climate change, as I mentioned. So oftentimes looking at the big picture is important and to help identify data gaps for our local government partners. And again, not following those municipal boundaries that are necessarily helpful for waterways. Speaking to the comprehensive vulnerability assessment planning, so besides sharing, analyzing, and disseminating data, we're also, which is informative to this resiliency planning, we're also funding different phases of vulnerability assessment planning. So the first step is actually the development of a vulnerability assessment, which is forming lists of critical infrastructure assets, looking at potential future sea level rise or heavy rainfall in certain areas, and then identifying how those critical assets are going to be impacted and developing a report on what those municipalities should focus on. So that's step one. The next step is grouping some of those critical assets, figuring out which areas are the highest priority, and developing plans which identify specific projects with engineering and design plans that those municipalities can go out and find funding for. And again, pulling together federal, state, local funding and fund those adaptation action area plans. So we're funding each stage depending on what each of our counties needs. But there is $200,000 going to each county, so roughly $2 million going towards vulnerability assessment planning in Southwest Florida. All of this work informs where and how to upgrade infrastructure, make communities safer in the face of more extreme rainfall and storm events, as well as lessen stormwater pollution and reduce wastewater overflows to better protect natural resources. So again, it's that nexus of community needs and natural resource needs because they don't operate in silos. They operate in tandem. Biology is messy and we need to work together. We can't just do natural resource management. We understand that it needs to be strategic and it needs to also benefit the community. All right, so moving along to going with the flow, we have funded several watershed restoration models and hydrologic restoration plans and projects through the Southwest Florida region. There's a couple that we've done for Lee County and a few that we've done in Charlotte County and in some of the inland counties. This is again helping everyone to understand where these fresh water can be moved from where it's doing harm to where it can be helpful. This also helps us identify strategic areas for supporting land conservation because those can be natural water storage areas. So again, this is benefiting natural ecosystems, buffering them, making them more ready to handle climate changes, but also protecting downstream communities. So giving wildlife habitats, pathways, and spaces to migrate. So one of our studies is the Habitat Migration and Restoration Needs Model and Plan. So basically what we wanted to understand, and I'll get into this in the next slide, is where habitats might migrate in response to sea level rise impacts to vegetation, and where inland habitats, because this isn't just happening on the coast, but where inland habitats might shift and change depending on different increased temperatures, flashier rainfall that we talked about today, what's going to happen to our really important wetlands. And that's helping restoration managers understand how to be strategic about where they're implementing projects and what projects are implementing. And then again, understanding the nexus of green-gray infrastructure, which I'll get into. This is an example project where we're getting ready to go undergo construction of a living shoreline, basically a living shoreline buffer in front of the seawall. Again, this will be creating additional habitat and spaces for the fish to hide, spaces for additional mangroves to migrate, while protecting a really important economic area downtown Punta Gorda. So this is the modeling results from our habitat evolution model. This is, again, where we were trying to understand how vegetative communities are going to shift in response to sea level rise. We had a phase 2 of this where we were understanding how wetlands are going to shift in response to changing evapotranspiration and temperature rates. But you can see here, so the red are mangroves, and you can see how those mangroves start to push upslope and upstream, moving out salt marsh, which is that other arrow in the teal, and then eventually getting pinched out between hardened shoreline and sea level, rising sea levels. And so what we want to do, this helped us understand and create pathways in our plan to say, all right, let's focus on areas that are going to help these mangroves migrate upstream and upslope. Maybe we use green parks, we preserve those as parks that are on the waterway, and so that those mangroves have places to go rather than hardening those shorelines. It also helps land conservation organizations. They actually use this plan to identify areas and then nominate them at the state level for preservation. So, but we needed to do the science to help them understand what, and then to have the backing to understand what and where to be strategic, because we can't preserve everything. People need, people need places to live. We need to support our economy. We have agriculture in this region. So how do we be strategic and protect our natural resources that are protecting us? So moving into our lessons learned. So first lesson learned is past is not prologue. All of our prior data is based on historic conditions, but conditions are rapidly evolving. And so we need to continue to collect data. We are ourselves trying to fund some of that data collection. We are encouraging other agencies to continue that data collection. We're recording never seen before conditions. The Peace River rose by 19 feet, more than had ever been seen during Hurricane Ian. That is record rainfall. And we want to be plugging all of that information back into our models or hindcasting to understand what's different than when we were, set up the plan. So this means we should be constantly continuing to adapt our plans and looking back at our data to understand what we could do differently in the future. This illustration here is actually a plume of moisture from the Western Caribbean that delivered heavy rainfall to southern Florida, where some areas received up to 10 inches in less than 24 hours. This is a once in 1,000 years event. And just for context, what we're normally looking at for planning is a once in 100-year storm event. So again, we want to be accounting for these types of events. All right. I'm going to move into our other lessons learned because I am going long because this is an exciting topic for me. So we also want to share that we've seen that the rate of change may not be gradual. It might be or linear. It might happen all at once. We've seen record erosion after Hurricane Ian. We can see some of these ecosystems might even reach a tipping point. We've seen some seagrass loss, major seagrass loss in Charlotte Harbor since Hurricane Irma, and it hasn't really recovered. So that's something we want to be thinking about and accounting for when we're doing our planning. Trial and error can lead to learning or success. So we want to be learning not just from our, let's see if this will actually play the video. Yep. So we want to be learning from our failures or things that were maybe a stopgap and not just things that were like a roaring success, and be sharing them in forums like this because it's going to be really helpful for planning down the road. This is a video of a citizen seagrass planting in the Caloosahatchee in an area where we didn't think that Vallisneria, the seagrass there, could thrive. But we planted a different strain of that grass, and you can see where it's growing and thriving, and it's attracting fish in the area. So again, sort of moving around the barriers that we think exist. Pilot projects are pivotal. So we fund a lot of pilot projects on behalf of our local government partners to help them understand what's going to work in our area specifically. There might be projects that work across the United States that don't work locally, and we need to understand what those are. Buying time aids adaptation. This is sort of what we were talking about with our the habitat evolution model. If we can buy time for our mangroves to move upslope, we may not lose as many mangroves and thus not lose as much habitat. So even temporary interim measures can matter. Protected lands protect communities. Here's an example of Orange Hammock Ranch, which is just upstream of the city of Northport. This area received a lot of the floodwaters after Hurricane Ian. City of Northport already flooded pretty devastatingly during Hurricane Ian. Had that conservation area not been preserved, had that been developed out, the flooding would have been probably even worse. And again, this is an overarching theme for today. It's not green versus gray, it's green and gray. And how do we build them to support one another to protect our communities and our habitats? And finally, healthy ecosystems are resilient ecosystems. Much in the same way, if you have a weak immune system and you catch a cold, it can cause long-term effects on your health. Versus when you're healthy and you catch a cold and it's over quickly. Same with these ecosystems. These increased storm events can really have devastating effects to our ecosystems. And so what we want are ecosystems that are strong and healthy that can really withstand these events. You know, the seagrass, again, comes to mind in Charlotte Harbor and the Pine Island Sound estuaries, where it still hasn't really recovered from Hurricane Irma, and we're seeing continued algal blooms, like large mats of macroalgae growing over these seagrasses, and we're trying to figure out how do we make these systems healthy so that they can overcome this increased amount of nutrients in the waterway. And, you know, in light of recent storms, we just wanted to share that you know, a couple thoughts that we had about them. You know, every storm is different, and so we want to be continuing to collect data at the local level to understand what the impacts of those storms were. It even varies regionally. Look at the storm surge in Punta Gorda from Milton and Inglewood versus down in this area. The rainfall from Irma that you all received that didn't necessarily affect a lot of Charlotte County. We want to continue to collect data locally and plug that into our models and our planning. And again, we need to be paying attention to these storms, and you know, there's a lot of variability within them. And thinking about that when we're communicating the impacts of the storms to our area and to our communities and how we're communicating about that, we want to be taking all of that into account. We don't just want to, again, that's going to the past is not prologue. We don't just want to be thinking, oh, this is how storms are in my area. That's not true anymore. We've seen that. Everyone's seen a different storm that's been greatly impactful to them in the last 5 to 6 years. And storm variabilities and impacts have been increasing. There's a lot of new science identifying what level you know, climate change has contributed to making storms more rainy, stronger, and how they're more impactful to all of us and where we're living. So we want to continue to think about that science and incorporate it into our planning. And with that, I just wanted to give you a few resources to look into to learn more. You can visit our Facebook, YouTube channel, our website. Come to the Southwest Florida Climate Summit. We are hosting a day on September 18th before the full Florida Climate Summit up at the new hotel in Punta Gorda. So we'll be hosting a one-day event on the 18th, and then the full Florida Resiliency Summit's the 19th and 20th. And yeah, please reach out if you have any additional questions. And we really appreciate the presentations today and hope that some of these lessons learned over time will be helpful to you all as well. So thank you.
Hello. Okay, perfect. Okay, so our next speaker is Lara Roman. So I see we've got you on the line here. Can you hear me?
Yep, and I just shared my slides. Can you see that?
Yep, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to let you go ahead. Yep, okay, we can see that. I'm going to let you take things away.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. Greetings from California. So I am a research ecologist with the USDA Forest Service, and I will be talking about best practices for urban tree planting initiatives. And my presentation draws from a just published article that I worked on with the colleagues listed at the bottom of this slide. So let's step back a minute. What is the ultimate goal of tree planting initiatives in cities? To plant trees, right? These photos here come from two of the amazing programs that I've been fortunate enough to collaborate with. the Sacramento Shade Program of the Sacramento Tree Foundation, and the Greening the Gateway Cities program of the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. So planting trees is the goal, right? I would say wrong. Planting trees is a metric that gets at one part of the accomplishments, but it's not the primary goal. I argue that tree planting is not the goal in and of itself, but rather tree planting is a means to achieving the broader goal of creating cities that are more livable, sustainable, and equitable. And the two programs I highlighted on the previous slide are actually great examples of clear goal articulation. Both programs are actually funded with a rationale for energy savings. In Sacramento, the goal was to provide thermal comfort and building energy savings in the very hot summers of California's Central Valley, while the Massachusetts program was originally focused on trees as windbreaks in the cold New England winters. And it's important to emphasize that different tree planting initiatives and different projects can have different objectives. Sometimes objectives might differ for particular planting sites and neighborhoods. One program might emphasize energy savings, while another might be narrowly focused on stormwater runoff mitigation, or equity, or nature play for children, or food produced through orchards. And maybe a program even targets more than one of these objectives. But a really critical thing to keep in mind is that no single tree, planting site, or program can simultaneously maximize all of these objectives at once. Some goals have really obvious conflicts. If you're planting an orchard, you're not going to be maximizing shade. And there are always going to be trade-offs. If you maximize one objective, then another objective gets downplayed. And that's why it's really critical to develop a plan up front, preferably with community and stakeholder input, about what the main priority objectives are for a particular planting campaign, and have those objectives guide species selection as well as decisions about what kinds of land uses and neighborhoods to plant in. So there's one more thing I want to go over quickly before diving into best practices for planting initiatives, and that's a quick overview of typical urban tree lifespans. I'm not sure if some of you folks have heard this myth, but there's a myth in the urban forestry space that the average lifespan of a city tree is only 7 years. And it's not actually true. It's based on some old estimates and not empirical field data. But here I'm just going to give a few slides related to a literature review that some colleagues and I did about urban tree mortality. So this is called a survivorship curve, and it's showing the proportion of trees surviving after planting in urban settings. On the x-axis is years since planting, the y-axis is percent survivorship. So the middle curve is based on the median or midpoint of annual survival and mortality rates from this literature review that we did. The upper curve is based, and lower curves are based on the first and third quartiles, basically better than worse and better than normal and worse than normal situations. So that little bend at the 5-year point is based on how we sliced up the data from various studies, grouping together studies representing the establishment period from studies representing times after that. And then we have that lighter gray color for these curves after 20 years because of the fact that there are extremely few studies reporting survival or mortality past 20 years. So we're really extrapolating at that point. So the dashed line represents the population half-life, which is when survivorship is 50%. In other words, when half of the planted trees have died and half are surviving. For that middle of the road typical situation, about half of the planted trees are dead at 13 to 18 years. So if anybody asks you, how long do planted urban trees typically live, you can say about half will be dead around 13 to 18 years after planting, or just call it 15 years to keep things simple. So for the better than normal situation, that number would be 33 to 38 years. For the worse than normal situation, the number would be 7 to 11 years. This slide is showing the same survivorship curve, but I'm pointing out the proportion that survived to the 5-year mark. For the kind of normal situation, it's about 70% that would survive to 5 years. So I think it's fair to ask ourselves, if trees really are critical green infrastructure, then let's think about other kinds of built infrastructure. Would we accept this rate of failure for bridges, street lighting, or sewer systems? Would it really be okay if the typical middle-of-the-road performance was for 30% of newly laid down sewer lines to fail after 5 years? And one more thought to leave you with before I get into the best practices. Although there are a great many factors related to tree mortality in urban settings, for establishment mortality, meaning the deaths in those first few years after planting, there's abundant evidence from my studies and others that tree care or lack thereof is often the driving cause. To be clearer, when proper planting techniques and basic establishment maintenance are missing, young trees are much more likely to die. So now the best practices. I want to emphasize that everything I'm about to share here is laid out in a new article that has just been published in the Journal of the American Planning Association, and you can access that through the Forest Service. I'll make sure that the organizers have the link in case they want to share it out with attendees. So the recommendations that my co-authors and I articulated in this article and in this presentation today are grounded in both the scientific literature and from our own experiences studying and collaborating with tree planting programs. And I like to think of these best practices as channeling the insights and wisdom that I've heard from arborists, foresters, and community organizers over many years. So the best practices are organized around 3 phases: pre-planting, which includes setting goals, stakeholder and community engagement, and planning; installation, which includes buying and planting the trees and any other steps that are part of installation, such as cutting concrete and installing irrigation; and finally, the post-planting phase, when maintenance and monitoring are crucial. So really, the timing of tree planting isn't limited to a single planting season or a planting day photo op with the press. The best practices are also organized around 5 themes, each of which cuts across all phases. The first theme is fund, ensure adequate funding across all phases. Second theme is place, adopt place-based landscape design. And then people, conduct deep civic engagement and invest in communities. The fourth theme is plant, follow established best practices from arboriculture for the development, installation, and care of trees. And last but not least, learn, evaluate performance and outcomes, and adapt from lessons learned. So here's a table depicting 3 phases and 5 themes. I'm not going to, at this moment, go over every single box here, but the rest of my presentation is going to unpack some of the major points. So for the fun theme, I want to introduce you all to a term called green wasting, defined as an initiative presented to the public as environmentally meaningful, but which fails to achieve its goals. The photo here comes from England and a press article complaining of the wasted funds for a town's tree planting due to political pressures to rush to plant. According to this article, only 10% of over 6,000 trees planted survived. There's another example I know of from Beijing, China, where trees planted prior to the 2008 Olympics basically violated all arboricultural norms in terms of lopping off roots and packing trees into trucks, planting them super quickly. My graduate school advisor studied those trees with another former student of his. 25% of the trees were dead only 11 weeks after planting. So I think we can all agree, I hope, that we don't want this kind of outcome or press coverage. The last thing I want to see is for 1 year, the press to showcase golden shovel planting events, and then 1 or 2 years later, news coverage about how that planting failed. Part of the problem is that budgets are sometimes organized to maximize the number of trees planted. Based on a survey of tree planting initiatives in the United States, the business as usual situation is that most money goes towards purchasing trees. Only about 12% typically goes towards establishment maintenance. So here's a suggestion. Consider roughly equal allocation of funds across the 3 phases, with 1/3 for each phase. And I want to emphasize that this funding can come from all streams, which might include a mix of municipal general funds, philanthropic donations, and grants. However, since many planting projects are dependent on short-term grants, municipal leaders are encouraged to consider ways to institutionalize funding streams, which can include ordinances, stormwater and development permits, and bonds. Next, the place theme. In deciding what to plant, where to plant, and how to go about the process of planting and tree care, it's important to take into consideration the environmental and social issues of a particular city, region, and neighborhood. One example of this is celebrating tree planting as a significant cultural event in a manner that honors the local community. This photo comes from a planting event in a Los Angeles neighborhood. Mariachis came to the celebration, which was a really special way to do this in a neighborhood that is predominantly Latino and rich with Chicano heritage. Another aspect of paying attention to place is to engage stakeholder networks, including various kinds of professionals. In addition to tree experts, and depending on the project, it might be a good idea to involve landscape architects, community organizing specialists, hydrologists, and civil engineers. These various professionals need to be part of the conversation, especially during the planning phase, which is what's shown in these photos from 2 different planting programs in northwestern Indiana. For neighborhoods and streets that have extensive concrete and pavement, landscape architects and city planners can help with making room for trees and coming up with creative design solutions to make space for pockets of trees and other vegetation. These kinds of steps are especially essential for tree planting and canopy growth in any neighborhood with high building density and limited areas of easily plantable sites. Next, on to the people theme. Engage residents and community leaders throughout all phases, from goal setting and project planting through planting day celebrations and stewardship of young trees. It's important to note that lack of community engagement can backfire. Some residents don't want trees, including situations where people have experienced tree-related problems, from fruit droppings that might occur above someone's parked car and people might find that annoying, to trees falling on people's homes and cars in storms. Low-income communities can feel these problems acutely because families don't have the funds to recover if a tree damages a car, pipes, or a house. Some residents might prefer small stature trees because they seem less likely to pose a financial risk in the future. Research I've done with colleagues shows that stories circulate around neighborhoods about the dangers and problems from trees, and residents have sometimes experienced decades of disinvestment from municipal parks departments. It wasn't that residents didn't like trees, it was that they didn't feel supported in having trees. And this is all related to inequitable patterns in some tree planting programs, with relatively wealthier neighborhoods tending to request trees more often. So it's important to listen to people's opinions and priorities and have that input shape where trees are planted, what species, and broadly recognizing that for some communities, there's a fundamental lack of trust in city government, and try to rebuild that trust through community engagement and well-run planting programs that prioritize tree care and maintenance. The people theme encompasses sustained collaboration with local community leaders and residents, communication with the public, and workforce development. The conversation around tree equity and environmental justice has really taken off over the past few years. However, that conversation is often narrowly focused on distributional justice, which includes the spatial distribution of existing canopy, as well as patterns of where trees get planted. However, environmental justice has 3 pillars. The distributional justice is just one component. The other pillars are generally considered to be procedural justice, which is about how tree planting is planned and implemented, and recognitional justice, which is about how different cultures and worldviews are incorporated into tree planting. For tree planting initiatives to be truly equitable, it's important to offer meetings and communication materials in different languages when appropriate, and offer meetings at times when working residents can attend, preferably with food and childcare. Doing deep and genuine community engagement is a core part of environmental justice. I want to borrow a line from the nonprofit American Forests here. Tree equity is not about trees, it's about people. For example, procedural and recognitional justice can be advanced through workforce development, offering paying jobs and career pathways for local residents. The next theme, plant, involves in the pre-planting phase, investing in nursery relationships. For planting campaigns with huge purchasing power, there's even the potential for advanced procurement contracts to get the desired species mix. Another part of the plant theme in the pre-planting phase is matching species to intended tree benefits and goals. Native species are generally the best choice if the top objective is wildlife habitat, whereas large shade trees are appropriate if the objectives are shade and energy savings, and small stature trees are right if the objectives are reducing tree risk related to built infrastructure, or certain small to medium trees are best for their flowers or fruit, for cultural appreciation or food production. And also during the pre-planting phase and related to nurseries is the need to have a diverse planting palette of species, including species that can tolerate changing climate conditions. And all of that time to work with nurseries can take substantial staff effort to accomplish. And of course, from sourcing nursery stock to planting techniques and establishment care, there are best practices in arboriculture, some codified in standards and guides published by the International Society of Arboriculture. There's also often simplified versions of these best practices for the general public that local urban forestry organizations produce, such as this example from Los Angeles. From the research I've done tracking survival and mortality in planting programs, a lot of the young tree losses come from extreme lack of any maintenance at all, such as trees that aren't getting watered or were planted way too deep or too high. And this brings me finally to the learn theme. Often when reporting on the performance of a tree planting initiative, two of the main metrics are the number of trees planted or given away and the number of volunteers. But personally, I don't think that's the best way to report on program performance or evaluate success. Instead, let's talk about the health, growth, and survival of trees through the establishment phase. And let's think about those main objectives for a particular planting initiative or planting site. For example, if the objective was shade, then measure temperatures as the trees grow. And I want to point out that the two images at the bottom are guides for urban tree monitoring that I co-led with another Forest Service scientist. And these guides contain field protocols for tracking trees for survival, growth, and health, as well as general tips and strategies for any organization that wants to monitor the trees that they plant and manage. And we actually now have these translated into Spanish. So this learn theme is not meant to be onerous. Rather, this theme is about setting aside time to reflect on success as well as failure. Build in time for staff and stakeholder reflections. What worked and didn't work, what can be improved for next planting season or next grant cycle. So in conclusion, I want to remind everyone of a key point I made at the start of this presentation. The goal of tree planting initiatives in cities and towns is not actually to plant trees. Rather, tree planting is a means towards the broader goals of creating sustainable, livable, and equitable cities. So this doesn't mean that having a target to plant a certain number of trees is necessarily inappropriate. Sometimes that numerical target is what's needed to secure grants and gain the support of local politicians. Having a golden shovel at a planting day is okay too. It can be fun for the funders and the mayor. It can get the media attention. That's a really nice feel-good story. But we do need to think about so much more and so much bigger than golden shovel planting events. For those who are really working in the trenches and making tree planting happen, I think it's crucial to keep in the front of our minds what we're really planting all of these trees for, and have that guide how initiatives are structured, including the time and resources and funding for the pre and post planting steps. And so last but not least, I just want to again offer my sincere appreciation to everyone who's ever let me study their trees or even just had a chat with me about how their program works, because those collaborations and conversations inspired everything in this presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks again for such a wonderful presentation. I do want to note that obviously we're hearing some common threads and some common themes among some of these high-level summaries. And last, we're going to have Tom Ankersen bring us back to that high-level policy lens. And then I'll close things out with some brief closing remarks. We'll take questions. Sorry, we will have a quick Q&A, and then I will close things out with closing remarks. So Tom, feel free to take it away.
Okay. Well, I figured there might not be anybody here, but I figured many people figured that rush hour has started and they might as well wait. So here we go. How do we go here? Like that? Okay. There we are. So while I'm getting underway here, just a sort of a background, a little bit further background that led me on this path to have this conversation with you today, which is sort of the result of all the work I've done in the area over the years. The first time that I got, I guess I should say the first time, but an early involvement in this was with the city of Punta Gorda, and my students were working there and helping them to revise their comprehensive plan, the coastal management element in particular. The term sea level rise was just becoming something that people talked about. It didn't exist anywhere that I was aware of in local government comprehensive plans or in local government policy. We added those 3 words and suggested through the comp plan that the city consider that and move forward with planning around that. That resulted in I think it was the Regional Planning Council basically pursuing a grant from EPA to do a vulnerability assessment, which they did. And that resulted in further work by the city of Punta Gorda, which became at that point something of a poster child in terms of planning around sea level rise. That was only 2007. So when we talk about movement, I mean, that's not that long ago. When was the iPhone? That way? I'm used to yelling because I was a lecturer, right? So, okay. All right, fair enough. Anyway, so that's that story. You heard a little bit from Haley on the Cedar Key Master Plan, and for living shorelines. That was something I worked on with my students as well from a policy perspective. That master plan was based upon a suitability index for living shorelines, which Jenna had described. They mapped it, described it, and then we wrote that into their comprehensive plan. We took that and we asked the DEP, will you give us a general permit for the entire island based upon the fact that we've identified where the living shorelines should go, where the hybrid facilities should go, et cetera, et cetera. They said yes, but of course it hasn't happened because so many other things happened that pushed that into the background, and maybe now it's run its course. In Yankeetown, one of those other little communities to the north here, we worked on an adaptation action area. You saw, I think Nicole mentioned that, but one that was focused entirely on natural resources and wrote that into their comprehensive plan. More recently in Cedar Key, just before the storms, we concluded, when I say we, I mean my colleagues at the University of Florida concluded a vulnerability assessment using that Resilient Florida money, and identified some 95 projects that needed to be done to make Cedar Key more resilient from large to small. Of those 95 projects, that was drafted into an adaptation plan. That's when the policy took over. We took that adaptation plan and put it in and made it an amendment, the substantial amendment, basically to their community redevelopment plan, their CRA plan. I'm not sure how many folks here are familiar with CRAs, but CRAs are a basis for local governments to get incremental revenue from taxes that they wouldn't otherwise get, communities, based upon creating a district. That money can then be used as matching funds for the projects that were identified in the adaptation plan that had been the result of the vulnerability assessment. So that's the science to policy regime all the way through. That wasn't part of the presentation here, but I thought it might be useful to show, particularly for those of you who are in local governments here, opportunities that exist for this. This is the title of this talk is Inching the Ball Forward, Embedding Policy Preferences for Nature-Based Solutions into Florida Law. This is a blog that I write for Florida Sea Grant. This talk is the combination of 2. The first one is already there, and it talks about the existing opportunities for nature-based solutions, and then I will continue on with some recommendations at the state level for things that can enhance the ability to address some of the issues that we've been talking about in terms of impediments to policy. So I'm going to try and get through this. This is what we hear and this is what we say every day, today, all day long. It's easier to permit a seawall than it is a living shoreline. Permitting nature-based solutions is like putting a square peg in a round hole. It's a legacy regulatory program for a new era. Permits for nature-based solutions are treated like gray solutions. They are guilty until proven innocent, right? You have to go prove why this is good for nature when it should be obvious. And then we've got to get things to scale. We can't do little 200 feet living shorelines all the time. There's got to be a scale-based, we've got to scale that up and get further along. Here's what we know, some of the things at least that we know. This is a quote from a colleague of mine at the law school, wrote an article on sea level rise and property boundaries. Sea level rise is predictable, unidirectional, ongoing, and geographically pervasive along the coast. It's not going away. We have to deal with that. It's a different world. Shorelines are getting squeezed between the proverbial rock and the hard place. We've talked about the coastal squeeze issue quite a bit here. Nicole is looking at that carefully. But it's hard to go out. Going out meaning away from the land. It's into the onto the submerged lands. Why? In other words, you want to do this restoration. You want to make the shoreline more resilient. You want to bring back an intertidal zone, and so you don't have just open water to a seawall, but you've got this public trust resource out there. You have the submerged lands owned by the state, protected by the state. You have protected species. You have protected habitats. You've got the issue of navigation and obstructions to navigation. And you have riparian rights. Those are the rights of private property owners who are on the shoreline and have certain rights that are unique to them, which some of these solutions may or may not affect. In restoration science, we know that bigger is usually better. They'll last longer. The things will work better. And that fill is not a dirty word. Even though it may still be a dirty word in our regulatory lexicon, for restorationists, it's not necessarily a dirty word. And then bigger, getting to scale, usually means more regulatory scrutiny. So all of those things are sort of obstacles to where we're going. The larger perspective here, this is the policy paradigm, if you will. So, it's the federal, it's the state, it's the local. The federal level, there's not a lot of lawmaking going on in the traditional sense of Congress meeting and passing a law that says something about nature-based solutions. What you have right now is an executive order issued by the Biden administration, which directs federal agencies to put the emphasis on this. Good question whether that will withstand the change in administration. It may. The key players at the federal level are the Corps, FEMA, and the Department of the Interior. And they all have, at some level or another, treated this issue in their internal approach to their own lands or their own regulatory apparatus. At the state level, you have funding. We'll hear most about the Resilient Florida program, and then you have this constant issue of permitting. At the local level, you've got comp plans, you've got the land development regulations, and then you have financing. What are those vehicles for nature-based solutions? I'm going to spend most of my time on the state and a little bit on the local and not deal too much with the federal here. So definitions, the first thing you look for when you're a lawyer is how is this defined? These are the definitions that I was able to pull out. You can see that the state of Florida does have a definition, so it's in our statutes. It's in the Resilient Florida Grants Program. And interestingly, it sort of mirrors more of the Department of Interior's definition and includes this socio-environmental challenges. So I think that's kind of a interesting thing in light of, particularly in light of some of the things that we've talked about today in terms of it's not just about, it's about the people and not just about the ecology. So here's where we're going to get into the weeds, and I may try and just blow through it, but we'll see how it goes. This is the Florida legal framework. This is how it works if you want to get a permit to do a nature-based solution in or around the coastal and estuarine waters in the state of Florida. The first two things you have to think about, what's called proprietary, the ownership of those submerged lands you want to work in, who owns it and how do they own it, and then the regulatory, that is, who has the regulatory, the legal authority to tell you what you can and can't do on those lands. These are distinct, and ownership is a much more powerful vehicle for the state of Florida than is regulation, but they work together and are often treated together in the permitting process. And I'll just say again, the feds are really important. You all know about the Corps of Engineers and their permitting process as well, but we'll leave that for now. So sovereign submerged, how many people know what sovereign submerged lands are? These are the lands that are owned by the state of Florida by virtue of being the state of Florida. They are held in trust for the people of the state. So they are not, the state of Florida is to give away necessarily, even though that was the pattern in the state through the 1960s. They are constitutionally protected. under Article 10, Section 11 of the Constitution, and something that goes back to Roman law called the public trust doctrine, which basically treats it like a trust, like you hold something in trust for someone else. Well, the state holds these lands in trust for us. So it is a constraint on the state as well as it is on us what can be done. And that may explain some of why the state can be so protective of these, because they feel like they are holding something in trust for us. It's governed by a state statute, and it is administered not by the Department of Environmental Protection directly, but by the governor and cabinet. They are the trustees, and so they have the trustors. They're the trustees. They have the authority and the responsibility to administer our sovereign submerged lands. They are staffed by DEP, so you deal with that up until it becomes at a certain level or a certain amount of controversy, and then it gets bumped over to the governor and cabinet. But other than that, you're dealing with the Department of Environmental Protection for the most part. And then how do these work? Is this working for you guys? You want to hear this? I don't know how much people know. That's the sort of thing. It's okay, I'll continue. So on sovereign submerged lands, what you need to get in order to do a nature-based solution is what's called a use authorization. Okay, and that is the authority from the DEP, or actually the governor and cabinet who delegated it to DEP, the authority to use that land for some purpose or another. It's rarely a sale anymore. It used to be a sale, or it used to be a deal that, to fill and put in housing developments. That's not the way it works anymore. It's always just a temporary, if you will, an easement sort of approach. The theory behind that is that behind having to get this authority authorization is that you are preempting other public uses. That is, if you put in a marina and there's a dock and there's boats, then somebody can't fish there. So somebody has to make the decision that that's okay. And they call that preemption of sovereign submerged lands. And you have to pay for it in the case of a lease. So the forms of use authorizations are easements, which most people are familiar with, a lease, a letter of consent, consent by rule, and those are all in sort of descending order of how strong they are, how important they are relative to the disposition of the lands. There is a test for allowing this use. It's called the public interest test. It's a very vague sort of thing that has been fleshed out a bit, but under the Constitution and under the statutes, the state constitution, if you want to get a use authorization, you have to demonstrate that your use is not contrary to the public interest for most sovereign submerged lands. However, for those that are within an aquatic preserve, which much of the state is now, by the way, then you have to determine that you have to prove that it is in the public interest. So two different legal standards that get argued about in courts and in administrative hearings and so forth. And then the rules themselves define what is the public interest. And what you can see is it's a cost-benefit analysis. Is do the benefits outweigh the costs? And if they do, then you can get your use authorization. There's a long list of things that you use to determine whether or not those benefits outweigh the costs, but that's how that works. Okay, permitting. So permitting is the other side of it. You have this use authorizations, this right to use somebody else's property. I've got 5 minutes, it's not going to happen. This basically is the history of what we now know as the environmental resource permit. You probably all heard about those. So environmental resource permits are required for activities that occur on the uplands and on the wetlands, and they are dredge and fill, and they are stormwater management. And it took a long time to sort of unpack where that came from. It's historical. It goes back to 1995 when they merged a couple different programs. I'm going to leave it at that. But the key thing here for us is that when you are affecting something in, on, or over the wetlands or other surface waters, then you are subject to getting an environmental resource permit, and as well as stormwater management systems on the uplands. And so there's the legal standard for how you get one of these. You have to prove that these are not be harmful to the water resources of the district, and then you have to give reasonable assurance. These are legal terms that the lawyers will argue about if it goes to court, will not. And then there's a whole list of issues that you have to prove it will not do. So again, we're talking about, this is the legacy regulatory program of the state of Florida that was going back to before we were talking about nature-based solutions as the most important aspect of protecting for the future, or one of the most important aspects. So people will go, well, ours is, we're doing a mangrove restoration. Why should we have to prove all this? Well, those projects can fail too. We've talked a little bit about that. So you have to think about that in terms of how, if you're going to reform this law, how you're going to do it so that you don't, as I said earlier, throw the baby out with the bathwater. And then, of course, you have the public interest test, which works through there as well. The bottom line is probably the most important. The burden of proof is on the applicant. So you have to prove that you're not going to have these impacts on those sovereign submerged lands, on those water resources in the area of water quality, flooding, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the types of permits you can get. Janet talked about the exemption. It's not really an exemption. I always thought an exemption meant you didn't have to do anything. You're automatically in. But no, you have to submit an application. You have to send Tallahassee a check. But it's a very fast-tracked process. And it's for small-scale projects typically. Then there's the general permit. This is a broader permit. It's also called a programmatic permit. It means basically, we've looked at this whole program, your Living Shorelines program, your master plan for living shorelines in your community, and we've concluded that you fit within all the boxes, and therefore we're going to give you a permit to do that because you fit within all those boxes. Then there's the individual permit. Once you get kicked out of there, you're in the individual permitting world, and that's the one where people talk about 1 year to 2 years and staff turnover and all the other issues that make these projects difficult. And one that's not been used to my knowledge that could be, and this is one of my recommendations, if you want to say, or ideas, is the concept of a conceptual permit. This was created for ports particularly and for large-scale developments, but it doesn't mean it can't be used elsewhere. Where you can identify a list of projects in Charlotte Harbor or in Tampa Bay and say, we're going to do all these nature-based solution projects, and we want a conceptual permit. That means the burden shifts after the first permit to the DEP to say why you should not be given that permit in the future if conditions change in some way. Otherwise, you can go forward on a more fast-tracked way, project by project by project. So each of these has obstacles and opportunities. Here's some of the obstacles: federal state permitting criteria alignment between the feds and the state. There's a lot of that, and that frustrates many of us. You have to do all this interagency consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service and FWC on endangered species. There's something called essential fish habitat, very significant, and which is the National Marine Fisheries Service, navigation of FWC and the Coast Guard. Then you have this issue of riparian rights, the rights of property owners, on the other side of which there are property owners that don't want a living shoreline. There are property owners that don't want beach nourishment. The whole case up in one of the United States Supreme Court in the Panhandle was all about people that didn't want their beach nourished because they didn't want the people being able to use the beach in front of them. So this was obviously wealthy folks. And then there's this issue of statutory clarity, this issue of regulatory turnover, and finally the presumption of guilt. She says wrap up, but can I keep going? Okay. I think I'm pretty close, actually. I'm on opportunities, so we'll wrap up in a quick way. So this is kind of interesting. This is a Coral Reef Task Force declared. This is a U.S. Created entity declared coral reefs to be national natural infrastructure. What that meant was that hazard mitigation grant money from FEMA could be used to restore the reef because it would protect people. That's hazard mitigation. Very interesting. This is an idea that I've kind of had, was that FEMA has a whole new rating system now called RR 2.0, rating risk reduction 2.0, and it looks at individual parcels as opposed to looking at areas and saying you fit within this flood zone, therefore you pay X. They have the ability to look at individual parcels. When they do that, they look for two things. They look for elevation above base flood elevation, and they look at how far you are from the shoreline. Particularly down here, why can't they look at whether you have a riparian mangrove fringe that is 50 feet and we know creates all these flood protection benefits? It's easy to see. It seems to be easy to fit into their model and program it, and easy to therefore easy to reduce your premiums accordingly. State funding, I'm going to skip over this particular one on the top, but the one on the bottom I think is particularly interested because this is the first time I've seen in Florida law where ecosystem services are valued. In other words, you can if you can cost out what the ecosystem service benefits are of that project, it gets credit in the selection criteria for this grant. That's like the holy grail for environmental economists right there. State rules, we've talked about some of these issues. These gets into the weeds a little bit, but the whole idea that you can only go out 10 feet, the 4-to-1 issue that Jenna talked about, it sometimes doesn't work. The Corps allows you to go out to 30 feet in terms of this permitting. So this is from the mean high tide line. That is in the works. There is a living shorelines general permit being developed by DEP. It's not been public yet. But they're at least talking about going out a little further. I think it's 15 feet or something. And it's going longer. So instead of 500 feet, it may be as much as 1,500 feet, all of which are very good for those of you who want living shorelines. There's a brand new seagrass restoration one, and they have one for nearshore reefs too. So the state is inching the ball forward, if you will, in this concept. And this was my thinking on the conceptual permit. You could just make it explicit and create a whole section, just like they have one for ports and one for multi-scale developments, so the kind of the big idea that I've been toying with is, can we create a permit for nature-based solutions? So it's not part of that legacy permitting where it's an individual permit for and maybe shift the burden of proof a little bit, change that burden, that presumption, and create this presumption of the public interest for nature-based solutions. That requires the legislature to act. So that would require those of you who advocate here to assist. And it requires coming up with some language that will work and deal with some of the thornier issues with when these projects go bad and that sort of thing. So, so there's that. And there are examples where a public interest presumption has been given, and I've worked through the statutes to find a couple of those, and that's what those are. And then there's a new, there was a statute proposed last legislative session. It's back. It's called the Mangrove Planting Protection Act. I think it should be important to the folks down here. It would require, all of this I think is in the new statute. I was just looking over it with Rachel. But I think it would go a long way toward helping to develop plans and programs for mangrove protection. And then there's the local opportunities. Again, there's the Yankeetown project that I worked on. Down here is the idea that you could use tax increment financing. This was for basically for blighted maritime infrastructure, because you have to demonstrate that something is blighted in order to create a CRA. But there's that. So that's kind of an idea of a reinterpretation of statutes. But it's a unique financing vehicle because it's gives you a steady source of revenue, and it's revenue neutral in terms of taxation. So look, I did it maybe a little bit over, but say lovely.
Okay, so thank you so much to our final speakers who helped really synthesize everything. So first, I can't even see. Okay. Oh, and you have a microphone. Okay. Okay, so we're just going to see if there's any final questions and answers, and then we'll kind of close things. Any final questions? And then we'll close things out. I'm actually going to hand this microphone. Yep. Can you take that back to the table and you can share that with Nicole? Okay. And actually, Amber, do you mind seeing if there's any questions in the Q&A as we go? Okay. So Bridget has a microphone. So we're first going to see, is there any questions in the audience about for the final three speakers, anything that you saw? Maybe that we're hitting the end of the day. Our capacity is not quite. So it looks like Amber has a question. So, okay. We're just getting the microphone to her.
Yeah, thank you all. It's hard to be at the end of the day, so appreciate everything you all have shared, particularly fascinated with the plant presentation. But my question is about permitting, because that does seem to be somewhat of a theme today. And I can understand why that would be a difficulty to try to get some of these projects going. But knowing that some of these permitting regulations that are in place are to protect things like wetlands that also provide that resiliency for us. So how can we sort of use that surgical knife to sort of do what we're trying to do to improve the streamlining of these nature-based solutions without maybe opening things up where we might, see that being used to perhaps, streamline wetland permitting?
Well, that's the hard part of this, but I think it can be done, and you have to start by defining and describing nature-based solutions in a way that it only applies to nature-based solutions. So you may lose some of those that are a little edgier, and those are a bit more hybrid as a result. But I think it could be done by creating a separate track, I suppose, would be a permitting track for these, and then the other thing is that we talked about, I think at lunch or in the break, was educating the regulatory staff on these types of projects. So their scrutiny will be there, but it may be more informed, and they may be more willing to make decisions and judgments that would otherwise bother them, I suppose.
Okay, any additional questions in the room?
I had one quickly too, if there wasn't.
Oh, yeah,
for you.
absolutely.
So has anyone done, it sounds like nobody's done the conceptual project or conceptual permit yet. So if potentially we had an oyster restoration plan for all of Charlotte Harbor, identified oyster restoration sites, use science-based information, would that be something that would be a candidate for that? And we need somebody to go forward and do that and see if it works. Okay. Okay.
Something that's bay wide, that takes 20 years. I mean, the whole theory of this is that ports have to invest heavily, and they need to have some certainty going down the road that the projects that they plan for port expansion will get permitted. So they do a lot of the upfront work first on the permitting on this conceptual level. That's why it's called a conceptual permit. They get their first individual permit, and the subsequent permits that are identified for the projects that are identified in that conceptual permit then are fast-tracked or streamlined or looked at differently. The burden of proof shifts, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think that would be a great approach.
Okay, Amber, is there any online questions? Any final questions? We probably should get you the microphone. Bridget, right? Gotcha.
So when you're talking about the conceptual plan, I'm kind of thinking back to the federal mechanism, the habitat conservation plans. Is that similar to that in the way it works? I mean, it sounds like it is.
Somewhat, yeah, somewhat. I mean, habitat conservation plan, yeah, it's basically a suite of things that you do, but they're not all things that are permitted either. They're just they're things that are done regulatory. Local governments have to do this, that, and the other in order to accomplish to ensure that the species. But yeah, I think that's not a bad analogy.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, any final questions? Oh, it looks like we do have one more here.
I've heard a couple of times about the development of suitability indices for the living shorelines. Are those project specific?
Well, Jenna could answer this better than I. Are they project specific? They are a group of living shoreline, potential living shorelines that have been reviewed in advance, and it's determined that the habitat, the conditions, the hydrodynamics, all of that is suitable for X, Y, or Z type of living shoreline. And then you map that out and you proceed to, if you put it in your local government comprehensive plan, for example, that would tell developers what they can do where and under what circumstances. And it's the same, it might make the permitting agencies more amenable to permitting those things as well if they see that it's part of a master plan to accomplish something that's greater than the single small living shoreline.
And we've certainly seen some of those kind of indices put together in multiple communities where they've mapped out the suitability for living shorelines. Sometimes they've adapted the VIMS model to do that. Right. So that's something too that if folks are interested, I can find some of those examples for you so you can take a look at that. And that might be something that we can highlight in the future to show you areas that have done that kind of analysis to say, and obviously, for example, Jenna was able to point out that they've done some of that kind of work. So that's certainly one of the ways that you can assess is this option good for my community, is to look at those characteristics and figure out, where would be good places to site these options. So I think I'm going